Fortunately, our guest on the show today is an expert on this topic and can help us understand the risks as well as the rewards of better supplier management. So, here with us now to discuss this very topic, we're very happy to welcome Tim Lozier of EtQ back to the show. Tim,
hey
thanks
guys,
for being here.
How are you?
All
right, terrific.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Well, we published an article from you yesterday titled Risk Management Outside Your Four Walls. In the piece, you talk about risk and suppliers in our increasingly complex world. So give us a little context. What's changed in the last maybe decade or two that's made supply chain management more challenging, more risky, I guess, than it was in the past?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you think about where we are in business today, there's a lot more complexity. You look at the product variation, the length of supply chains, and also the globalization of industries, and you start to see a lot of risks that start to crop up from what it was years ago. I'd say some of the big areas that we're seeing is certainly growth. So when you look at the growth of a business or a market segment, the supply chains get longer, they get bigger, there's a lot of variances in the supply chain, and that inhibits a lot of different things like visibility. So one of the things that we're seeing is that the visibility from when a product is being realized to the actual supply chain providing materials becomes an issue. There's a gap in communication. This also leads to a lack of control. So we find that companies are challenged with being able to control what's going on within their supplier organizations and feeding information back and forth. And this all comes as an overreaching risk. There's a lot of different risks that exist out there, from losing your critical skills to loss of intellectual property to ensuring that the quality that you are expecting within your organization is being matched within the supply chain. So all these things are bumping up against each other, and a lot of companies are still struggling to get that communication, create that link. Really move from a pure supply chain operation to more of a supplier network, where suppliers are actually collaborating on the same information within no lag time and no loss of communication.
Tim, you mentioned in your article 3 basic and effective risk assessment tools. Could you just kind of briefly recap those for us and tell us how they help people assess risk?
Sure, and of course I don't want to spoil anything for our webinar next week, but I'll give you a tease. We're going to talk about a lot of different things that you can do to look at risk, and like I said, risk is something that companies are looking at from an internal perspective, but also need to look at it from outside your four walls, whether it's external stakeholders or customers. And there's some tools you can actually use to treat risk in many different ways. We're going to talk about decision trees, which are a very simple way of asking kind of what if this, what if that, and ask the questions to really provide you with the decision. Another way to look at it is from the beginning. When you start looking at your product design and you start building out product and process design, what can you do to do a FMEA or a failure mode effects to not only look at your internal processes and the components that you put together in your product, but also look at the supplier dynamic. How do you look at the different risks and potential failure modes, and how do you communicate that with your supplier to ensure that at the beginning you're really mitigating risk? And then the last component, or one of the last components, is a risk matrix, which is a very simple and well-known concept where you're plotting sometimes 3 areas on a graph that allow you to look at the severity and likelihood and come up with a score. Now, the interesting thing to note is that what many companies are doing is they're getting to that point where they're identifying their risk, but really that's only half the battle. It's one thing to know that you have a risk. It's a whole other thing to know how to treat that risk and what actions to take to actually truly mitigate what you're doing.
And that's perfect lead-in, because once you've done that assessment, really the question is what next? I mean, in your article, again, we don't want to spoil anything because we are going to have a webinar on this next week, but you do in the article refer to 5 options, decisions, I guess, that help you handle those risks. So maybe you can kind of run through those briefly for us as well.
Sure, and just thinking around that whole concept, risk management is a process just like anything else, and it's actually a process that you can fairly easily insert into your existing operations, your existing processes without any real interruption. But one of the areas is on treatment of risk, and the idea that if you've identified your hazard and you've identified that you have a risk, how do you treat it? And there's a couple ways you can do that. You can, one, accept it. You could say the risk is enough that it's worth the risk, so to speak. Another way is to reduce, which is what a lot of companies do to actually mitigate their risk, put processes and controls in place. But you can also compensate it, so you can seek ways to insure yourself against that risk. You can also transfer risk, and that's something we're talking about with supply chain, is maybe outsource it. Maybe outsource an area or a critical skill or a skill that you can't, that is inherently risky internally, that you can transfer out to mitigate from an outsourced resource. And then obviously, if the risk is too great, you could reject it. You can just stop that altogether and look for a better way to do things. And those are just some of the ways that you can go about treatment options. Certainly, we'll talk more about it next week, but that's kind of a taste of what you could possibly do.
And Tim, we're going to wrap it up here, but I want to ask you before we go, I want to ask you to maybe look at the crystal ball a little bit as you see it. More and more data is coming at us faster and faster all the time today. So given that, what can we expect tomorrow? I mean, supply chains are going to get even more complex. So what's going to be the best way for us to manage that complexity and reduce risk and achieve all of our goals?
Sure, yeah. So what we're seeing and what leading companies are doing right now is really trying to eliminate that gap from point A to point B. Point A being I have a problem, and point B is I solve that problem with my supply chain. And it's really around that concept of how do I create a supplier network? How do I take the systems and the tools that I'm using internally and actually build out functionality or processes that allow my suppliers to essentially collaborate in my systems without access to my systems. And so something we're going to be talking about is looking at the gaps that a lot of companies are seeing within their communication and their visibility and control, and looking at how you can automate some of those areas and how you can really use the tools that are out there to build a supplier network to allow you to send information, the right information, and have the suppliers really participate, send information back without going through the clutter in between and communication, and really getting from point A to point B as fast as possible.
Well, all that and a lot more is going to be included in the webinar we're doing together, Tim. We're doing a webinar with you on Thursday, April 28th, titled Risk Management Outside Your Four Walls, Implementing Risk Strategies for the Supply Chain. Again, that is April 28th, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. So, Tim, we will see you then, and we'll dive into this a little more deeply next Thursday.
All right, thanks, guys. It's been fun.
Okay.
Thank you, Tim. We'll talk to you then.
All right.